Welcome to Broad Eye, the podcast that explores knowledge gaps in ophthalmology and eye care.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Bruno Fernandez, and we are here for another episode of our Broad Eye podcast. Like today, I have the pleasure of having Christian Gutierrez, which is the director at 2020 Therapeutics, a spin-off Verily / Google. Christian, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, Bruno. How are you?
I'm doing good. Thanks for accepting our invite. I'm really looking for a conversation. I always like to, me having a medical ophthalmology background, I love to talk about people that are in the field, but with a completely different background. And I feel like I learn a lot.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here.
So on that, why don't you just start talking a bit about yourself? What's your background? What's your training? Where did you go to study? Where were you born? All the personal stuff.
Sure. It's a bit of a convoluted story, but I'll try to make it short. So, by training, I'm an engineer by training. I have a background in electrical engineering and biomedical engineering. I did most of my undergraduate work at Caltech, and then my doctoral work, my PhD at USC. And then sprinkled in between my undergraduate work, I also majored in business economics and management. And then while I was getting my PhD at the University of Southern California, USC, I also spent a significant amount of time at the USC Marshall School of Business, trying to get an MBA, but they wouldn't let me sort of get the MBA and PhD at the same time. So I stopped short and got a sort of a certificate program that focused solely on entrepreneurship and tech entrepreneurship specifically. I suppose prior to my training, I've been in California for the better part of 15 years, in LA mostly, and then up here in the Bay Area for about the last 6 or 7 years. But I actually grew up internationally. I grew up abroad. I grew up in the Middle East, in countries such as Qatar, Oman, and Saudi Arabia. I spent 16 years there, so I grew up abroad. But I'm originally from my family's from Costa Rica. So
all right,
Latino.
Love Costa Rica, man. I've been there a few times already.
Actually, that's a beautiful country. Country. My whole extended family is there. So yeah, a bit of a diverse background. Following sort of graduate school, actually, let me talk a little bit about that. So I did my PhD in biomedical engineering, and I was focused on bringing together my training in electrical engineering and then my interest in the medical space. And I ended up applying that in the field of ophthalmology. And so one of my advisors was Mark Humayun at USC, who's a world-renowned retinal surgeon. So I did a lot of research focused on what at the time was a big project, which was the second site Argus retinal implant. And we were more on the research side. So I was specifically looking at technologies, for example, that could take the implants that were in patients at the time that had, I think, a 4x4 array of stimulating electrodes that would stimulate the retina and produce phosphines that the patient could use then kind of to gain some form of functional vision. Again, this is for patients with retinitis pigmentosa. And I was focused on the technology side, bringing together my electronics background to see if we could integrate that even further and extend that from a 4x4 array or 16 electrodes, let's say, to something that had something more along the lines of 1,000 electrodes within a small area of about a 5 millimeter by 5 millimeter area, which was the size of the implant.
So the idea would be to condense more the electrodes, right? Because the area is quite limited.
Exactly. The area was essentially the same. So all we're doing is condensing the electrodes and integrating the technologies necessary to do that. So how do you apply the necessary microfabrication techniques to make sure that you can shrink things down, to that level of precision? There's new processes that are required to do that. How do you keep the implant flexible and still thin? And so all the process technology behind that was something I spent a lot of time focusing on. The other part I spent time focusing on was developing novel sensors. And so what I realized was that these implants were going inside the eye, and the surgeons were implanting them, but were doing it just by feel. There was no other feedback about how well these implants were sitting in the eye. Are they in close apposition to the tissue that it's stimulating? It was really highly, highly variable. And so one of the things that I developed was novel sensors that we could put on the back of these implants and train surgeons to do the implantation technique, but have feedback about how well the implant is lying inside the eye. Previously, they were sort of blind to it and just doing it by feel. And that also required development of novel microsensors and microsensor technology. So that was my sort of R&D background. And again, also spending time at the business school. The business school at USC was really interesting because it got me exposed to many entrepreneurs, that would come and speak, talk about their experience in totally different fields, in an app or in the car space or in just totally different industries. And it was great to understand how they think about building a business, right? And so, for example, one of the things that you learn, or I learned there, was that the average business owner, when they launch a company, is spending no more than about $10,000 to $15,000 on average. And you look at the medical space, and a lot of people say, well, I need to get to VC funding and have how many millions of dollars right away, otherwise I can't start a company.
Yeah.
And that difference was just so stark to me, and it really opened my eyes to how people start companies. And the other big thing was learning from their failures. What didn't work? What did they try? What are some of the alternatives they were creative about, and how they got their company launched, right? How did they deal with customers? How did they get pre-orders, things of that nature? So that really sparked my interest in startups and innovation. And then coming out of school, that's what I ended up doing. I ended up co-founding a company called Fluid Synchrony, focused on implantable drug delivery.
It related to ophthalmology or any medical specialty?
So initially, it was focused on the eye, but we decided to broaden it beyond the eye, and just really because the goal of that company was to develop very small, very low power drug delivery technology. And the eye is great, and there's applications in the eye, certainly, but going to the eye is really a pretty high stakes game. Yeah. And so in order to get first customers, in order to get, early traction, one of the strategies we employed was to say, who else needs this? And what was interesting is we found out that many, contract research organizations that are doing research broadly with drugs and are experimenting constantly with new molecular entities, new APIs, new drugs, they need a really rapid way to screen through the losers to identify the winners or the ones that have promise, and then pass those to the next stage. So if you go very, very early into the drug development pipeline, beyond sort of the chemistry and entity formulation side, but you're going to the first tests, that's where there's actually a bottleneck, because a lot of these new drugs that are under development require very specific delivery mechanisms, very specific delivery schedules. And believe it or not, a lot of this work is done by technicians injecting these drugs. And they usually use some sort of rodent model or something like this. And depending on the complexity of the regimen, those experiments get very expensive and they get very tough to do. And there's just not enough technicians in the world to go through all the different types of scenarios that these guys would like to do. So we ended up offering a solution that was an implantable drug delivery device for that market. And so the idea was we could have an array of experiments ongoing with one operator, basically at a workstation, digitizing the entire drug delivery experiment in whatever way they wanted, because the little pumps that we were developing were wirelessly controlled, and you could control an array of them. So one person could perform a wide array of experiments. Yeah,
so that's my question. So it's not like a slow release device. It's actually like a microdosing controllable implant.
Exactly right. It was not a passive. It's not a materials play. This was an active micro pump system. Which borrowed from my background in electronics and my background in microtechnology.
And how small are those?
Well, they're about the size of a dime. We had a few different sizes depending on the model of interest, but the smallest was about the size of a dime and had a payload of around 200 microliters. So a pretty small payload, but the models are small and you don't need a lot of drug. They were also refillable. So if they lasted a day or two, you could come back and refill it and then have another couple of days of experiment. So from 200 microliters all the way up to, the biggest ones that we were working on were around 2 milliliters of drug. And these were for larger models.
That's cool. So what attracted you to ophthalmological space? Because most people that we've interviewed that are doing anything related, that don't have a medical background, they have a bit of a story that attracted them to it.
Sure.
If you have one.
Well, I think it was just, I guess maybe part of it is that I personally have pretty poor eyesight. I have a prescription of, I think, plus 7. And so it's not a very common prescription. So without corrective lenses or without contact lenses, I am pretty legally blind without correction.
Mm-hmm.
So I heavily rely on my vision correcting aids, whether it's glasses or contact lenses. But I think that was part of it. I think the other part of it was I was looking for a way to apply my training in electronics and microtechnologies, and there's a big space there for example, semiconductor, creating chips and things like that. But it's really, that's a couple steps removed from having, I think, a personal impact on somebody or having a visible impact on somebody where you see that there's a connection. Chips go into cars and computers and all sorts of stuff, and microwaves. And I wanted something a little bit more, where I could see the impact. And I did a lot of soul searching for about 6 months about where I wanted to go with my sort of career and my training. And that's where I came across, these technologies that, for example, Second Sight and USC was developing. And it just fascinated me that with microelectronics, with microtechnologies, you could have an impact on somebody's sight. Somebody that's legally blind or is completely blind, you could offer them a way to have some functional vision through the use of technologies, of microtechnology specifically. And that really, I think, spoke to me. And it really was the foundation of how I made a decision to get my doctorate in the area. I sort of went to the world's leaders in this area. There's Stanford had a good program. There was a program in Germany as well. There's a few programs around the world. And I went to the leaders there and said, hey, I'm interested in this. Would you be able to, offer research that would make sense with my background? And when I ended up speaking to the folks at USC, my other advisor, Ellis Mang, who's an expert in microtechnology, and then Marco Mayan, who's a world leading retinal expert, that combination within one place kind of made it a no-brainer for me to go there and explore. And so that's a great decision I think I made, and it really aligned with my interest. But that's how I sort of navigated into ophthalmology.
Yeah, no, I mean, having an ophthalmological background myself doesn't surprise me that much, and people get marveled by what they can do. I think returning sight to someone, it's the closest thing that we can do to magic. And it's so rewarding when you see, the way patients respond to it.
That's right.
Okay, back to work. So you started your own company, and what happened then? Because eventually you joined Google, and I want to save some time to talk about that. But what happened, from A to B?
Sure.
Were you acquired?
Yeah. So this is around 2010, and we ended up growing that company from really just two people to about, I think we had about 12 people about 2 years in. We'd hired several engineers. We were raising money. We had operations ongoing. We had customers, so we had some early revenue. We'd raised, I think, $3 million or so. So the company was moving forward. It was going actually pretty great. And then around, I think, 2013 or the end of late 2013, I don't know if you recall, but Google X, which was the sort of exploratory lab of Google at the time, made an announcement that they were working on smart contact lenses. And at the time, the major announcement was around diabetes, sampling glucose in the blood and having smart lenses for diabetics so they wouldn't have to prick their fingers. And that just really intrigued me because, we were at the startup actively looking for partners, actively looking for, investors, people that maybe would want to acquire all of the above. And, I ended up connecting with a former colleague from Caltech that was at Google X working on some other projects. I think Google Glass and some of the other projects they had there. And I just sort of started exploring and said, hey, I heard this announcement of the lenses. Does that mean that Google X is getting into medical devices? Because that's pretty exciting. And if so, are they interested in other technologies? Are they interested in micro technologies for drug delivery? Are they interested in other types of medical devices? Because I work at a medical device company and we founded it, and there's maybe room to explore. And it was interesting that, he said, well, we have a pretty focused effort on these smart lenses, and we're really going deep into it. It's not a cursory thing. We're not necessarily looking for a bunch of other medical device technologies right now. But why don't you come in and chat, and I can show you a little bit about what we're doing and see if it makes any sense. I said, well, I get the opportunity to go to Google and hang out and talk to somebody who can share a little bit more. That's great. So I ended up doing that, and sort of one thing led to another. And this sort of colleague of mine said, we are really trying to get this program going in a heavy way, and there's a lot of challenges in smart lenses. We need people who have experience in microtechnology, in integrating electronics into very strange kind of environments, and who have a passion for working in the eye and solving problems, like really challenging problems. Would you at all be interested? And so he sort of flipped the table on me, and I wasn't there to look for a job, but the need was there, and I all of a sudden understood that they were having challenges in doing all these integration, really tough integration problems that they were trying to solve. And obviously I'd done my PhD work in a really challenging space. Integration was a key issue, and developing novel technology for that. So I could see exactly how it made sense, and in my head I already kind of knew probably the challenges that they had ahead of them. But it was a really tough decision because the startup was going really well, and but I think what changed the tide for me was I was able to see a little bit about the effort that Google X was putting into this, and I was just blown away by the resources. I was blown away by the seriousness at which they were taking the problem. So they weren't trying to get into the contact lens space very, very lightly and playing around with, silicones and casting some things and making some prototypes. Like they went all in. Like they were at a stage where they were producing like legit contact lenses on a pilot line, a contact lens pilot line, something that you would not expect to exist at Google, right? So, and so I saw that. I saw many other areas that they were developing, and I said, wow, this is real. This is something they're really getting into. And so, I had to sort of jump at this opportunity. You only get a few opportunities in life to have an impact and work on really exciting things like this. And so I decided to leave, but it was a really tough decision at that point in my life.
Yeah, like only people that had to make those abrupt career shifts understand the struggle it is to make such decision.
Exactly.
So what do those lenses do? Is it like a reservoir to deliver drugs? What do they want to accomplish with those smart lenses?
Exactly. So I think this information is all public, but the goal for the smart lenses at Google was, one, to develop a lens for the diabetes community that could sense blood glucose levels in the eye, in the tear fluid.
I remember that one. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. So that people would have to prick their fingers less. The other actually project that maybe is less known, but is also public, it just didn't receive the necessary sort of visibility as the others, was a project for accommodation. So for presbyopes, and so the goal there was to create a smart lens that could automatically change its focal power. And so the idea was that if you're a presbyope and you are having trouble focusing near, and you are either wearing bifocals, bifocal contact lenses, readers, all of the above, now all of those are a lifestyle compromise, because I don't think anybody of that age loves carrying around glasses, loves wearing both bifocals. And so it's been sort of this nagging thing that if you talk to anybody over the age of about 45, they all sort of raise their hand. It's like, oh yeah, I'm feeling it. I'm sort of on early onset presbyope, and I hate it. I hate having to wear my glasses. I hate having to. And so I think there was a really big opening there. And so the second big project was a smart lens with automatic accommodation for the presbyopia market. And in fact, that is the project that I joined Google X to start. There was already a team focused on the glucose side, but I joined to focus on the presbyopia project. And then there was a third project that was an intraocular lens, this is really a sort of a more far out one. It was very early stage, but an adjustable intraocular lens. And so those were the three big projects that were within the smart, let's say, smart lens space within Google. When I joined Google X, and that's what the partnership, we had a long-standing partnership with Alcon. That's what that partnership was focused on. And so we spent several years developing those technologies to a point where, they're sort of at a clinical stage now, but they're not ready for the market, or they haven't received approval at this point.
And out of pure curiosity here, like how it is like to work at Google, because like Google has this like almost like image of almost being like the Willy Wonka factory, it's like an amazing place to work, and you have like ping pong tables and like people dress the way they want it. Like, I mean, so what's the culture like inside Google? Is it like really the way like, I mean, we perceive, and very different from the traditional corporate world?
Well, it's a tough question. I think you ask everybody and they're going to have a different answer. Especially Google is a big company now. I think the last number I saw was over 150, 160,000 employees. When I joined, it was about 30,000 employees, which is still a big company, but it's several orders of magnitude, larger now. And so I think it depends a little bit where you end up going within Google. Google obviously has its core business around advertising and search. I think if you're in that part of Google, you're gonna probably see that there's a lot of core functions in the company that are more difficult to change. There's more hesitancy to or more, not hesitancy, but there's more understanding that is a core business, and we have to improve it, not put it in jeopardy or risk it, or do all those things. And so you have a slightly different. It's a well-oiled machine, right? So you have a slightly different experience if you're in that group. If you're in a group like Google Maps, or some of these other sort of really interesting and exciting add-ons that Google sort of eventually really went deep into, then you're exciting, and you're exploring how to add these functionalities to the Google ecosystem, and how to generate more value, and what are the other things that can add. Does it integrate with search? Does it integrate with its other businesses? So it's a little bit more freewheeling and exciting, and but also if it fails, it doesn't necessarily matter that much to the core business of Google, so you have more latitude. And then you have the really sort of front edge of what Google's doing, right? This is the stuff in AI, quantum computing, and then there was Google X at the time, which was an even more of an offshoot. It was designed to be a lab on its own that had, for example, secured access from the other parts of Google. So not everybody at Google could actually enter the Google X labs, believe it or not. It was sort of with its own sort of security. And within that lab, you had really like kind of crazy offshoot. It had nothing to do with search, really, right? It was smart contact lenses. At the time, it was self-driving cars. We had flying kites to generate power, satellite internet. I mean, there's a whole host of kind of crazy projects within that Google X lab. By the way, most of these projects people don't even know about, because you want to experiment in these projects, but if they fail, we expect most of them to fail.
Yeah.
Right. But that's a tough, tough business model for the outside world to really like understand about Google. Right. But projects were failing all the time. And that's kind of the point, right? Yeah. You wanted to fail many projects so you can get to one that seemed to have legs. And then you say, oh, wow, but this one could actually move forward. And those are the ones that people knew about. So they knew about, let's say, 6 or 7 projects, but I would say there's probably 60 or 70 that ended up, having some effort and then going somewhere, but then eventually saying, this is not actually where we think it's going to go. And then that would be shelved. But that culture was a culture within Google X Labs, which is slightly different than I think the culture at the rest of Google. So my answer is it depends, but within the experience that I had, it was really exciting. I mean, I was working next to people that were machine learning experts, people that had material science backgrounds, medical backgrounds, microtechnology backgrounds. It was a really super diverse group that you need to work on these kind of experimental projects. And it was, it was a little bit freewheeling. There are slides in the offices. Yes, there are beanbags in the offices. There are ping pong tables. But you do that because you're in an innovation culture, right? You have discussions over a pool table game about how you might solve the next integration challenge, right? And so you brainstorm. It's a lot of brainstorming. And so those are the environments that tend to promote that rather than people sitting, at their desk for the whole day. It doesn't really promote that very much.
Yeah, no, indeed. And on the getting wrong to get it right, like sort of approach, like that has I mean, tech and like medical research has a lot in common, right? Because like drug discovery, it's a similar process, right? Like, I mean, you keep trying different targets and different receptors, like trying different drugs, and like, I mean, you're gonna fail a lot until you actually get something that works. I think it is the trial and error method is underestimated. Right? And then people realize how much is used.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And okay, so fast forwarding now, I mean, you're now director of the 2020 Therapeutics. It's still related to Google somehow, right? Like, I mean, would you like to explain a little bit on how did that work, and like, I mean, what's the point of like, starting this company and the mission behind it?
Sure, absolutely. So, fast forward a few years, and Google overall ended up going through a bit of a restructuring that people are familiar with now. I think Alphabet was formed, and Alphabet became sort of the umbrella company, which now sort of Google is one of is the main and the biggest sort of company within Alphabet, and then other companies ended up spinning out. So, for example, Verily Life Sciences. So, Verily Life Sciences, previously Google Life Sciences, ended up being the life science arm of Google. And by the way, Verily Life Sciences, the first projects that formed Verily Life Sciences came out of Google X. So that included the Smart Lens project, and it includes several other projects, for example, in robotic surgery, and in some others that we had within Google X that were sort of being incubated. Those projects ended up coming out of Google X and forming the first round of seed projects that went into Verily Life Sciences.
And Verily is huge right now, right? I mean, what's the scale of it in terms of like employees or?
Oh man, yeah, Verily's grown a lot. I think my last check, they were probably above 1,000 employees. They're probably on their way to 1,300 at this point. Right, and Verily formed, I think, with about 50 people initially. so it's grown a lot in the last few years. And then along with Verily, there was the Waymo. Waymo, the self-driving car, also came out of Google X, but now it's its own independent company. So Google, Verily, Waymo, and I think 3 or 4 others. They're all sort of sister companies to each other, and they all sit under Alphabet now. And so Verily, so then I ended up moving from Google X into Verily, and I've been at Verily since its inception, since it was first formed. I was at Google X for about 2 years, and then Verily formed, and Verily's been around now for about 5 or 6 years, and I've been at Verily the entire time up until about last year. But the projects continued under Verily, and then Verily actually ended up expanding further within specifically the healthcare domain. And so what Verily was, its mission was to organize the world's health information, and so that was sort of the mission that Verily was trying to tackle broadly. And they've really diversified in a variety of areas, not just medical devices or exploratory innovations. Now they're in digital clinical trials. They're in offering solutions to health systems, and they have a broad portfolio of offerings now, and it's a really exciting company. And so they're growing. I think as the company grew and expanded its sort of ambition in the digital health area and healthcare generally, it became almost necessary to think about what are the specific projects within Verily that could use a different structure, for example. So if Verily is really targeting these certain areas of business, for example, digital clinical trials, and they want to focus in that, what role does, for example, medical devices play in that? And I think it plays a big role. But all the different portfolio of technologies that were within Verily initially, including smart lenses and others, do all of those make sense? And so you have to look at that holistically with the broader ambition of Verily. And in those cases, it may not make sense to continue to have them be part of the core portfolio. And so Verily's model has been very unique, and they've been strategic in establishing other partnerships outside of Google and outside of Verily, right? So Verily is known for having partnerships with major pharmaceutical companies. They're also known for bringing in outside investment. So Verily was one of the first companies under Alphabet to seek outside investment that's not from Google. And the reason for that was and I think they've raised over $1 billion, almost $2 billion from outside investment. The reason for that was to validate the business model and to validate the vision that Verily had, outside of Google. If other people believe it and other people see the value in it, then it must mean that there's something there, or at least people are willing to take a risk on that vision. And so I think the creativity and how Verily has been expanding its business was part of the formation of 2020 Therapeutics. So the opportunity came to work with a world-leading pharmaceutical company, Santen, focused specifically in eye care, and to pair that with Verily's expertise in machine learning, AI, medical devices, technology, and to create a joint venture between Santen and Verily, where you can bring the best of both companies and really focus it just in eye care. And that was a little bit of a tougher thing to do within Verily, right? Given the broad mandate that Verily had. But this joint venture structure enables us to focus really in a really concrete way in eye care and really tackle that market in a way that it deserves. And so that joint venture, 2020 Therapeutics, was formed in 2020. So they just a year or so ago. And it sort of had a double entendre, formed in 2020, but also we're tackling vision. So we're trying to restore 2020 vision. And the goal of 2020 is to really improve, restore, and extend eyesight to the world, bringing together and based on digital technologies broadly.
So it's more like a device-oriented company.
Not necessarily. No. Digital technology we understand to be broad. It's not devices. It could also be software. It could also be interfaces and ecosystems. The way that people are interacting with healthcare today extends much more than devices, right? People are doing things online. They're looking at data. They're consuming in different ways. And so I think when we say sort of digital ophthalmology or digital eye care, it's all of the above. Devices are part of that, but it's not the only part of the digital experience.
But not like developing drugs or...
So that's an interesting question, right? Because our name does have therapeutics in it, right? So when you typically hear therapeutics, you think of, you're developing drugs. The therapeutics part of the 2020 is, you're right. It's not that we are developing drugs from scratch. We're not going to be a biotech necessarily, but we do participate in therapy. And the way we participate in therapy is in a couple different ways. So we can partner, for example, Santen is a pharmaceutical company, right? So we can partner with companies that have drugs, and we can then pair them with our technologies to either enhance or to provide novel therapeutic avenues. And what I mean by that is drug delivery is one aspect. If we're not doing drug delivery, we are, for example, enhancing the drug adherence, for example, is another area. Or we are providing data and information that's going to be useful to development of the next generation of medication, right? So we are playing in the therapeutic space without necessarily being a biotech or an API creator ourselves.
Yeah, and that is, I think that there is the big unmet need, right? Because when it comes to the eye, drug delivery, it's a real challenge because it's small, but it's quite well contained. If you put a drop in the eye, it won't always get inside, or at least not in quantities that will reach therapeutic levels. So there are drugs out there that could be useful for eye diseases, but there's no way of getting them in.
That's exactly right.
I guess that's the gap that you're willing to
exactly.
fill. Yeah.
And there's a lot of great drugs out there that work if people take them, right? Which is the other big challenge that I'm sure you're familiar with. And so you can focus on developing novel therapies, but if you run up against the same issue that folks aren't taking the medication, then how effective is that therapy, right? So when we think about a digital ophthalmology approach, yes, part of it is the therapy side and developing new avenues there, but also part of it is, how can we use technology today to enhance therapies that exist? Because a lot of people are used to eye drops, but it's well understood that's a poor adherence mechanism in the long term. And so there's a big opportunity to, for example, create the potential for enhanced therapies overall if it's combined with a digital experience, where that digital experience is promoting the patient taking that medication more. And it's not just a simple reminder, hey, I have an alarm clock, take your medication. That clearly only has very limited benefit. But what we're interested in is more comprehensive digital experiences that can, for example, change behavior, right? There's a famous study from the World Health Organization that talks about what are the biggest determinants of health. right? And about 20% of what determines your health, your overall health, is, you know, medical care. So what the doctor is doing for you, what they're prescribing, what practitioners do, and the drugs that you take. The other 20-30% is purely about diet, exercise, lifestyle, you know, mindfulness, things of that nature, not smoking. And then the other rest of that is the third or so is going to be environmental, genetic, and social. And so we always, the industry broadly thinks a lot about that 20%. What is the doctor doing? What is the drug that's being prescribed? And kind of that's it. But the other sort of 80% of somebody's medical care, overall healthcare experience, has very little to do with what the doctor does and what the drug is doing, like right now. It's all these other things. Yeah. And that's the opportunity that we see without necessarily creating new medications. Can we provide digital solutions for all these other areas that are a big part of somebody's healthcare? And can that be augmented? Because I think if you augment that other sort of 70% of the medical care ecosystem through digital technology, you can have a much bigger impact, we believe.
Yeah, and I agree 100% with that. Remember my days of see patients, I just you see a diabetic patient, just like, okay, you got to control your diet and you got to do this. Good luck. We don't actually help them to achieve that in any way other than telling them what they need to do, right?
And like 95% of the time is they're at home, they're in their social circles, and they spend 1% with the doctor.
Yeah. And then this personal experience, I've been using those trackers now, right? That you put in the wrist, and it tracks you continuously, gives you some feedback on how good your sleep is. And I've always been health conscious, but now that I have a feedback, so come the next day, I was like, oh, your sleep was not great. And then what did you do? Is then maybe you ate too late, or you had a bit more wine that you should, or you worked too late, or you were on your phone, and then you see right away that feedback. It's okay, you harm your sleep. That it's much more efficient, on changing your behavior.
Sure. Yeah, part of it is putting the patient in control and seeing what's actually happening to them through data and through insights. I think the other part is helping them through navigating that behavior change or navigating to a healthier lifestyle, because that's not easy to do, right? Yeah. But there's a lot of experience and understanding of techniques and methods that do promote that. So we're seeing this, and this is an area that I have sort of particular interest in, which is the area of digital therapies, digital therapeutics. There's a lot of longstanding research that's understanding how to slowly change somebody's behavior in a positive way. And so you'd be surprised how much of that is connected to psychological cues, how much of that is connected to their support system, the family and people around them, how much of that is connected to the types of technologies and interface points that people are using during the day, whether it's a text message or whether it's your computer or whether it's none of those, right? It's the phone. How much of that can be used to slowly have people adopt new, healthier lifestyle habits? Because that's a hard thing to do. But if you can do that, and you can empower them with visibility into their own data, and we'll use the example of glaucoma, for example, right? Glaucoma is a really tough disease. And one of the big challenges is that there's no ocular pain. There's no sort of immediate vision loss. I mean, once you start getting vision loss, you're sort of, really too far along. But in the first years of receiving a glaucoma diagnosis, there's really nothing a doctor can point to visibly for the patient to say, look, you're making great progress, right? Because great progress would mean that your vision is staying the same. It's not getting worse. Yeah. And so for the patient, what do they need? What do they see as progress? How do they know they're making progress? It's hard. So if you can give them visibility into that through data or through measurement, and also promote healthy behaviors that entice them to, be adherent to their medication, improve their lifestyle, that combination of factors, that sort of ecosystem of digital inputs can actually have a better therapeutic outcome, long-term outcome, than a drug alone or the paradigm that we use today alone, for example. And that's a really exciting area for us.
Yeah, that was a great statement right there. For us to start to wrap up our chat, that took a lot of your time. Christian, thank you very much for what you shared today, man. Those are very exciting chats. I hope to maybe bring you in the future. Like, I mean, after you start actually releasing, like, I mean, some of your products, like, I mean, I'm excited to see what's going to come out of this.
Absolutely. No, thank you for having me. It was great. It was fun.
All right. Have a good day, man.
Thanks. You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
And that concludes today's episode of the Broad Eye Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Of course, ratings and reviews are always welcome. And you can certainly share this episode with any of your colleagues or friends who might enjoy it. Thanks for listening.